investigation into both Bob Vylan and Kneecap's performances at Glastonbury. It's over comments they appeared to make on stage about Israel and the war in Gaza. In the last hour, the Culture Secretary, Lisa Nandy, said the government is extremely concerned about what happened at the festival.
This government will not tolerate anti-Semitism. It has no place in our society. It is a poison and a cancer that must be rooted out, and we will be relentless in our work to do so.
In a statement, the BBC says it regrets not stopping the live stream of the performance of Bob Vylan, while Glastonbury said the band's comments crossed a line. A 92-year-old man has been found guilty of the rape and murder of a grandmother nearly 6 decades ago. Detectives are now investigating whether Ryland Headley may be responsible for other unsolved crimes. The government has confirmed disabled people already receiving personal independent payments won't lose them in changes to the welfare system. More than 100 Labour MPs threatened to rebel against the reforms if they weren't watered down. Work and Pension Secretary Liz Kendall says she's listened carefully to their concerns. It's been a scorching start to Wimbledon, with the hottest start to the tournament ever recorded. Meanwhile, 4 British players have made it into the second round already. In the city, the FTSE 100 has closed down 37 points at 87.60. The pound buys $1.36 and €1.16. LBC weather. There's a warm night ahead for southern regions, with temperatures staying in the low 20s. It's fresher in the north with lows of 11 degrees. There's another hot and muggy day in the south tomorrow with highs of 33 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Elizabeth Secker.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. It's 6 p.m. Now, Tonight with Andrew Marr.
Good evening. It's too hot. It's too hot for me, and it's too hot for you, and it's also, by the way, too hot for the government. Overnight phone calls by cabinet ministers to MPs preparing to rebel against the welfare reforms so far haven't crushed the numbers down very far. I'm told there are around 50 irreconcilables. People, number 10 says, want regime change. And then around 20 to 30 more who are winnable over. But Keir Starmer's case wasn't made any easier with the release of official figures today, suggesting that even after his concessions, these changes would drive up to 150,000 people into poverty. Downing Street says the numbers aren't accurate. Perhaps the government will get the vote through tomorrow, but with many rebels. There were plenty of Labour MPs in the Commons this afternoon who did not sound convinced about the concessions. Winning, despite a rebellion, is not, of course, disastrous. After all, Tony Blair's first government had a rebellion of 46 MPs over cuts to lone parent benefits and 67 over incapacity benefits, rather like today. And he went on to win another big election victory. And in the Commons, a victory is a victory. But up to a point, because there are two related dangers here. First, the Parliamentary Labour Party, which has been relatively undivided into factions compared to the old days, looks like it is now splitting into two groups, the Starmer loyalists and oppositionists, who are either facing disciplinary action or have already had such angry conversations with ministers they are in a generally mutinous mood. Quite a few of them want the Chancellor Rachel Reeves to be sacked. Others ask how long Sir Keir himself can survive. But this means that the Prime Minister's real majority on the difficult stuff is much less than it seems. It means that getting through other public sector reforms becomes much, much more difficult. And this takes us to the second problem. Because if the markets decide this is not a government able to effectively control public spending, and the welfare bill, having risen by £20 billion since the pandemic, is expected to almost double to £70 billion a year by the end of this Parliament, then the cost of British borrowing, already high, will jump even higher. These are circumstances which make it very difficult for the Chancellor, who's promised not to raise taxes on working people when she returns in the autumn with her next budget. It is a genuinely hot and sticky moment for the British government. So let's talk first to LBC's political correspondent, Aggie Chambré, because, Aggie, you have some exclusive polling for us which explains part of why this rebellion matters so much.
Indeed, Andrew. And I think this explains why lots of MPs have been quite so concerned, because these are the kind of things that they have been hearing from their constituents. So this poll, which is by 38 Degrees, commissioned by Survation, was put into the field just before that partial U-turn last week. It said most people, 51%, think the current welfare system does not treat those in need of social security with dignity and respect, and just 1 in 3 think that it does. 31% of those polls were personally worried about the potential negative impact of the proposed welfare changes, and 82% of the public believe that if someone is unable to wash or clean themselves, they should continue to have financial support for managing their condition. So as I say, I think those are the kind of things that MPs are hearing and have been hearing. And speaking to people and listening to Liz Kendall, the Work and Pensions Secretary, speaking in the Commons earlier, it is clear there is still a huge amount of concern among Labour MPs. I was speaking to one of those who's been coordinating the rebellion, and they said it is very unclear, in their words, whether it will pass tomorrow. There's also questions about what will happen to those MPs if they do vote against. Of course, this government does have precedent with removing the whip, at least for 6 months. They've done it before, yeah. They've done it before. And one MP said, I have to vote against the government, but it will be bad if I do.
And when Labour MPs say to me, I'm not a rebel, I'm not trying to bring down the government, I'm representing the views of my constituents who are really, really worried about it. Your polling suggests they're absolutely right.
Exactly, and I think this has been part of the problem for Labour MPs. They haven't felt listened to, but they have been listening to their constituents, and they have been hearing exactly that kind of polling, those numbers. They've been hearing this huge concern, and they have felt consistently that they just have not been listened to by the government. Now, I think there is some goodwill towards the government and towards the whips in Number 10 because they have made this partial U-turn. But there is a worry, I think, that it just hasn't happened soon enough, hasn't gone far enough. And I think, as you say, that number 50 being bandied around, but it does genuinely feel like there is still a chance that tomorrow the government could lose that vote.
We'll be all on tenterhooks. Aggie, thank you very much. Now, one of the MPs who hasn't been happy with this bill and was asking questions in the Commons of Liz Kendall this afternoon is Stella Creasy, who is with me now. Stella, very good to have you on the show. Can I ask you, first of all, to explain to people listening what your concern today was and what kind of response you got from the Secretary of State?
So we're in a better place in that the government is now engaging with the concerns about the practicalities of that. For many of us, one of the biggest concerns was actually this is a lot of pain for very little gain. There's no evidence that some of the changes they wanted to bring forward would actually save money because of the consequences of pushing people who are disabled into poverty. Having the government listen to that concern and saying, right, we're going to protect existing claimants has been a very welcome thing. The challenge that you heard today, and I think it's a very reasonable challenge, is the government is now also promising a review of entitlement to PIP. This idea of a TIMS review about the descriptions used to decide whether or not somebody would get the mythical 4 points, the threshold under which you get it. And yet that review will happen sequentially, not with the legislation, but after the fact. So we are going to face a hard deadline in November next year, so where the new 4-point deadline will come in, but Stephen's work won't yet necessarily be implemented. And I think for many of us, there's a sort of confusion about what would we say to the person coming into our constituency surgery who needs to apply from November 2026 and who would be going, well, hang on a minute, do I hold on to see whether the TIMS review is implemented, or do I apply now because I desperately need this help? And we should remember that PIP is an in-work benefit.
And this means that there are very similar people who are similarly disabled who have been treated in different categories. And you think that is also a problem?
Yes, I do, because the legal advice tells us that it is, and that we need to address that concern, that you shouldn't discriminate against people on the basis of their disability, which obviously having different systems. Well, I take the point that the government's making that we've got new systems and we move to new systems or people onto old legacy schemes. But what I worry about is Stephen is obviously going to do a very important piece of work about the PIP system and some of the categories I think people have now become very aware of, about this idea that you only get 2 points if you
can't wash yourself
and this sort of thing.
Indeed.
When and how will that influence actually people's entitlement to the point that we can advise our constituents when they come to see us about what is going to happen? We don't want 3 groups of claimants, let alone do we want to be held to account that we're discriminating in 3 different ways.
Stella, tomorrow you have 3 choices. You can vote with the government, you can vote against the government, or you can abstain. Do you yet know what you're going to do? And can you tell us?
I want to hear, and I'm pleased to be here to hear what Stephen is going to say.
He can still persuade you in the studio.
Because it doesn't make any sense. And actually, I know that Stephen and Liz want to get this right, but I can't go back to my constituents and justify what's being put forward at the moment. I can't vote for something that I believe breaches the laws that we've all said are important to uphold, the rule of law. So I need to see some movement on that, or sadly, I'm afraid they won't have my support now.
Well, this is very, very exciting indeed. We can see whether Stephen Timms, who just come down and sat beside you, can persuade you about this. Stephen, there was a series of questions from Labour backbenchers, all saying much the same thing. We love the idea that you are going to review how these payments are done, and that you're going to do it with disablement groups and talking to disabled people. We love all that, but we can't understand, since you don't report until next autumn, and the changes come in it next autumn, how you can really be influencing what's going to happen.
Let me just set out what we're doing. I think what everybody agrees, Stella, everybody, is the system doesn't work at the moment. We've still got a lower employment rate in the UK than we had before the pandemic. We're unique in the G7 in that respect. And this system is a big part of the reason for it. So we need to fix it. We're doing three things. Number one, bringing forward a big package of proper employment support, learning from the successes of the last government in getting disabled people into work. There are 200,000 people at the moment out of work on health and disability grounds who say they could be in a job today if they had the support to make it possible for them. We're going to provide that support. Secondly, we're removing very serious work disincentives in the current universal credit benefit system, including the first ever increase, real terms increase, permanent, in the standard allowance of universal credit.
Sorry, to jump in on that one before we get to thirdly, is this basically because people on benefits, if they try to get into work, if they try out a job, lose the benefit immediately and they're too scared to do it?
That is a big part of the problem, and that's why we're bringing forward the right to try legislation to put on the face of legislation that if you do try out work, you will not lose your benefit as a result of that. I mean, the problem at the moment is that the system, because the universal credit standard allowance is so low, a lot of families really struggle to keep body and soul together. They have to go to food banks. This has been a big driver of the huge demand for food banks over the last few years. So we're raising the universal credit standard allowance to ease that problem. And in the past...
And then you're freezing the incapacity part.
That's right. So the problem is people have been told, if you can persuade my department, the Department for Work and Pensions, that actually you're too sick to work or to do anything about work, then we'll give you significant amount of money.
About twice as much money at the moment.
That's right, absolutely right. £400 a month. And I saw a letter from somebody the other week that an MP sent to me that said, if only you classified me in this LCWRA group, then you would pay me £400 a month more and I would be comfortable. And the system sort of forces people to kind of aspire to be out of work on health grounds in this way, when what the system should be doing is encouraging people to aspire to work and providing the support to make work possible. Well, and the changes we're delivering will enable that.
I'm a great reader of facial expressions, and I can tell that Stella Creasy is listening to you attentively, but is not completely convinced. Stella.
Well, Stephen, I want to understand what's going to happen to the 40% of PIP claimants who are in work, because I think many of us understand and recognise the challenges that you're talking about. And when you and I did talk about this, we talked about things like the Future Jobs Fund and a national insurance contribution holiday for taking on someone who's disabled and trying to address those barriers for people who are disabled getting into work. But we should be clear that there are people who currently get PIP and under the new system would not get PIP who are already in work, and it's the PIP payment that helps them stay in work. So
you could push people out. You could push people out of
who
work.
Are in work already.
About 1 in 6 of current PIP claimants are in work. We'd like it to be much more than that. And I think given our employment support and the changes we're making, I'm very much hoping we will be able to do that. We'll significantly reduce the disability employment gap, as the last Labour government did. But it is really important that the cost of PIP should be financially sustainable, because if we don't make the changes to deliver that, then the future of that benefit will be at risk. And this is a vital support for a large number of people, many with quite severe impairments. They will be fully supported in the future, as they have been in the past. Current claimants, including those in work, will not be affected at all by this.
But
so it's a strong package to change things for the better.
But it is fair to say, isn't it, Stephen, that future people who might need PIP to be able to get into work and to stay in work, many of my constituents who have that PIP that allows them to cover mobility costs to be able to get into work, they wouldn't be entitled to that support unless they meet your 4-point criteria. So we could see people who would be...
That isn't right. We're not making any changes at all to the mobility component. So those
not just mobility, but those people for whom PIP helps pay for the support they need to be able to stay in work. If that support is dependent on them only getting 4 points, and on the current system they don't get 4 points but they get cumulatively, say, 12 points, those people would miss out in the way that somebody existing gets 12 points will be able to retain those rights, wouldn't they?
What we're doing is learning lessons from the last Labour government, the success of the New Deal for disabled people, providing much, much stronger support for the people that you're
Stephen, sorry to jump in.
To work.
Your answer to her question is effectively yes, isn't it?
No, I don't think it is. What we're saying for new claimants is there will be a different system. There will be very strong employment support provided. With the commitment that we've made. Some people who at the moment could claim PIP will not be able to from November next year.
Let me just jump. I'm sorry to jump in.
There will be other support provided for them.
I'm sorry to jump in one more time. But this is all about persuading people to go into work, employment support, and keeping people in work who are there already. And quite a lot of people look at the numbers and say the Treasury has simply not given you enough money early enough to get those people into work. In other words, it's not front-loaded, it's back-loaded, and there's not enough of it.
I don't think that's correct. We are, this year, rolling out the Connect to Work programme across the whole of England and Wales, which will, next year, support 100,000 people. So that support is in place in time, and it's going to build up to £1 billion a year by the end of the Parliament.
Stella, you listened to that. Have you decided what to do?
I think more work needs to be done about the people who are currently entitled to PIP, and that PIP is the difference to them being able to continue in work and not being able to continue in work, and future claimants who are exactly like that, because those people will come through our doors in November 2026 and we don't have an answer for them. You're doing a review, which makes a lot of sense to review these categories, because we've all looked at the categories and think they don't work. But that's not going to influence those people from November, and actually the clock is ticking.
So
you're so concerned.
In short, you are not convinced at this
I'm worried
stage.
we're going to have 3 different groups of claimants.
Stephen, last question. Are you going to win the vote tomorrow?
I'm talking to everybody who wants to discuss this, and I've been doing that today. I shall be doing it tomorrow. I very much hope we do win the vote, because this is a very positive package of reform, and everybody agrees reform is needed.
And I can see through your neatly tied shoes that both your toes and your fingers are firmly crossed at this point. It's not a yes. Thank you both very, very much indeed. And thank you, Aggie, as well. Now, coming up, after some desperate scrounging over the weekend from Number 10 to bring rebellious Labour MPs back on side, I'm going to be talking to a leading Labour figure to see what needs to change inside government. The time now is 6:18.
Weekdays from 7 a.m.
So we don't know how many and we don't know the cost.
Straight to the point.
Tell you what they're laughing at, those two. They're laughing at the law, and we're letting them.
Nick Ferrari at breakfast on LBC.
Inexcusable, shambolic failure.
Listen on Global Player or the new LBC app. Download it now from your app store. LBC. seconds. Tonight with Andrew Marr. Listen on your smart speaker. Just say, play LBC.
It is 6:20. Now, however this ends, it hasn't been an example of what you might call textbook political management by Number 10. Something seems to have gone deeply wrong in the relationship between Downing Street and Labour backbenchers as a group. Let's talk now to the outgoing boss of Labour Together and former Labour MP, Jonathan Ashworth. It's not very much Labour Together at the moment, is it?
Well, there's certainly stormy seas, but the government hasn't capsized. And look, I mean, for what it's worth, I think the government probably will, on balance, win this vote tomorrow. I think the concessions that have been announced will probably be enough.
But it's slightly on edge, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, it is choppy out there, and these things always are. Welfare is always difficult for the Labour Party and Labour MPs. I say it sort of slices through the souls of Labour MPs like shattered glass tearing through silk. If you remember back when you were reporting on the BBC, it was the biggest rebellion for Tony Blair back in the day. It's what put rocket boosters under Jeremy Corbyn's leadership campaign in 2015. These questions, so very difficult, and that's why I think the leading figures in the government probably have been a little bit blindsided by the anger amongst MPs. Probably now recognise that they need to do a lot more of talking to MPs, getting their insights, checking the temperature, because this is a bunch of MPs of high calibre, and they should be used.
They're proper people, as it were. Keir Starmer has given a couple of interviews, including to my next guest, in which he said, quite reasonably, look, I've had other things on my mind. The world is going to hell in a handcart. I've been shooting around trying to put things right. It's very, very hard to concentrate on everything, and we get it. But you can't be a Prime Minister abroad or at home if you haven't got a parliamentary majority. And the real question is, should Number 10 be doing more to talk to, but above all listen to, Labour backbenchers than has been the case before?
Well, look, I mean, it's an age-old complaint that MPs will say this leadership doesn't listen to us. Leaderships don't listen to us. I mean, I was in Number 10. We were working for Gordon Brown at the time of the financial crash, and we had a very challenging domestic policy agenda as well to get through. But you have just got to have your senior cabinet figures, your senior staff, doing their best to listen, to talk to MPs, to bring them in for the discussions as much as possible. But look, throughout history, MPs have always complained about, political operations, or they've focused on particular staff, the ones that they read about in the newspapers. That always goes on. In the end, what is going to matter to MPs is getting the policy substance correct, because MPs are reflecting what they're picking up in their constituencies.
I, from the outside, you from the inside, both remember the Blair and Brown years. And in those cases, there was a constant sort of political conversation going on at the heart of government, an attempt to win people over, to make the arguments. And that seems to be missing a bit at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say there were two issues the government, as we come to our 1 year anniversary, needs to think about. First, one's a point of style, this constant communication that you have to be doing all the time now in politics, much more actually than Tony and Gordon had to do back in the day. So your political leadership has to always be making an argument about and explaining the journey you're taking the country on. And people want that. They're looking for that. But also there is a policy agenda as well that you've got to get right.
And indeed, this week is 1 year on. And it's been a very, very turbulent year for Keir Starmer, not just because of these huge events abroad, but, internally, he's had to get rid of Sue Gray. Morgan McSweeney has come in. Now people are going for Morgan McSweeney. People in the Commons, as you know, are starting to talk about the future of the Chancellor of the Exchequer. There does seem to be a lack of political grip.
Well, look, I mean, funnily enough, on my new podcast, I was talking to Simon Case last week, and he was saying this is the toughest inheritance for any government since Clement Attlee in 1945.
I was talking to Simon Case last week as well, so me.
But he's right. I mean, the government has inherited a very difficult economic picture. They've inherited a very challenging set of public finances, so they've had to take some tough decisions. But they've got to be explaining the journey they're taking the country on. And I think they've got to focus on what people want, about how they're going to strengthen the economy, how young people can get on the housing ladder. But I would also say, whether it's these proposals or more broadly some of the other challenges which are coming down the line about how do you lift children out of poverty, this government cannot afford to lose its reputation for delivering fairness. People expect Labour governments...
That's what this is really all about.
Exactly. And people expect Labour governments to fix the NHS, which we are doing, and Wes is making great progress, to extend home ownership, and Angela Rayner's doing that. Do more workers' rights issues. Angela Rayner's and Johnny Reynolds is doing that. But they also want Labour governments to focus on supporting the vulnerable. Now, we've had good measures like the free school meals extensions of childcare, but I do think the government has to watch this, and it cannot lose that reputation for fairness, and will have to do something about child poverty as well at some point.
How concerned are you about the economy generally? Because we've had the last 3 months, disposable household income has actually fallen, and that's one of Keir Starmer's key markers for progress. And we've got an inflationary problem beginning to build up again, and a general sense that the economy is not getting the growth that we were promised.
Yeah, and that is in part because of a lot of what is inherited. But look, the Chancellor in her spending review in her budget has allocated more investment to infrastructure projects in the Midlands and the North. That will in time deliver productivity improvements, which knock on to improvements in growth. Fixing the problems of the NHS, by the way, is also a good economic policy, because that's also how you get people back to work who are currently out of work for reasons of sickness. So look, the government are putting in place the measures which will improve the economy, but they've got to deliver on a sense that the economy is strengthening and that living standards are rising sustainably in 3.5 years' time, because in 3.5 years' time, we'll be in a general election campaign.
We certainly will, and Nigel Farage is on your tail, as it were.
Absolutely.
Jonathan Ashworth, thank you very, very much indeed. Now, as we have been discussing, a lot of this is about the character and the political skills of the Prime Minister himself. Josh Glancy of the Sunday Times has been on the road with Keir Starmer, interviewing him at length, and he joins me now. Josh, very good to have you on the show. Keir Starmer kind of apologised in your interview for what's been going on this week, didn't he?
He did. I asked him about the backlash against Morgan McSweeney, his chief political advisor, and he was quite explicit. He said, I take the plaudits when things go right, and I carry the can when things go wrong. And he acknowledged that the level of outreach to backbench Labour MPs has been insufficient. He said he'd like to have got to a better place sooner, which is a very sort of Starmerish legalistic way of saying we dropped the ball here. And he pointed to distractions on the world stage. He said these aren't an excuse, but they are context. That he'd been in at the NATO meeting, he'd been dealing with the US strike on Iran, and prior to that, the G7. So it had been a very busy week with him out the country twice.
I've always found him a sort of thoroughly decent, humane kind of guy. But people say again and again and again, this is not somebody who has a very clear political vision or political ideas that he can express clearly. Did you find that when you were talking to him? Did you get any stronger sense of what Keir Starmer's mission really is?
I think your read is broadly the right one. I mean, it's clear that the art of politics, the machinations of politics, do not come naturally to him, nor indeed the media, the politics that's done in the media. In fact, I think I'd go as far as saying I think a part of him can be a little disdainful of that and see it as a distraction from the grave and serious matters of fixing Britain, of dealing with Britain, a turbulent world. And he often refers to things like the Punch and Judy of Westminster. Well, it can be pretty Punch and Judy. You know that better than I do. But it is also Parliament, and it does need to be done. And if you don't pay it sufficient attention, you get rebellions like we've seen this week. His vision is one of pragmatism. I mean, it's pragmatism within the sort of broad context of Labour values. I know those both words sound quite nebulous, but it's a sort of three-parter, the same kind of model they applied to the Labour Party. So fix the foundations is how he puts it, then reinvest and achieve growth in the things that need investment. And then there's this kind of vague sunlit uplands of a decade of national renewal, which I think we'd all love to have. But drink
the beer and watch the football. I mean, the trouble is, it's absolutely fine to be a bit disdainful of politics. Most of the country is, but it's harder if you are actually in the business of politics yourself. If you are a politician, did Keir Starmer reflect at all to you on 1 year on how it's gone? He can't be very happy with it.
Well, I did point out to him that his favourability ratings are, well, when I asked him, it was -46. I think the last number I saw this week was -56, which is a record low for him. He started on about 0. And I said, does this bother you? Do you worry that neither your party nor the country seem very pleased with the direction of travel? And he said, look, he keeps coming back to this. I mean, I think I described it in my piece as a sort of the parable of the tortoise and the hare. He keeps coming back to this idea that this is a slow process. It's got to be steady. They're not going to get everything right. A lot is going wrong in this country all at once. And that it is a bit of a plea for patience, really. I don't think the electorate is very patient. I think you're seeing that in the polling. I don't think Parliament is very patient. But he does, and I think he does have a bit of a point here that you can't expect results in a year. You probably can't expect them in 4 years, but certainly within a year, you can't expect a magic wand to have been waved. And there is a lot to be done, and it can't be done overnight. But he does keep seeming to get the politics of certain issues wrong, which I think is an impediment to him. We've had grooming gangs, we've had winter fuel, now we've got these disability cuts. And if he keeps having these crises, then, it sort of weakens the whole project, really.
It absolutely does. Well, listen, Josh Glancy, who has spent a long time interviewing the tortoise, thank you very much indeed for talking to me. Now, coming up, yet another controversy for the BBC, but how exactly have they managed to get themselves into such a mess this weekend? The former head of BBC Television News joins me. Time now, 6:30, and Elizabeth Secker has your headlines.
Police have started a criminal investigation into the performance of Bob Vylan at Glastonbury Festival on Saturday. Officers are looking into what appeared to be anti-Semitic comments and chants made by the frontman Pascal Robinson Foster. Earlier, the BBC admitted it should have pulled the broadcast. Belfast rap group Kneecap's performance is also being investigated. The government's U-turn on welfare cuts will cost taxpayers around £2.5 billion by 2030. The Work and Pensions Secretary's laid out the concessions she'll make as she tries to convince more than 100 Labour rebels to back the bill. An amber heat health alert has been extended to cover more areas of England, with temperatures set to reach the mid-30s. It now applies to the West Midlands and Yorkshire and the Humber regions until Wednesday morning. LBC weather, a warm and sultry night ahead for southern regions, with temperatures staying in the low 20s, but there's drizzle in the north and lows of 11 degrees.
LBC This Morning on Nick Ferrari at Breakfast.
Why would you hire Bob Vylan, this vile duo, who got formed, by the way? 20-minute tirade, I won't read it all to you. Foul language about music executives, bald-headed F-words, C-words, everything else, all and saying, we're live on the BBC, everyone chanting and screaming how hilarious it is. Where was someone to press the kill button? Just pull the plug. There's no conversation to be had here. It's done. It's out. Ridiculous. Why are you so utterly inept or incompetent? When might there be some action?
Nick Ferrari at Breakfast. Back tomorrow morning from 7. Listen on your radio, on Global Player, and the new LBC app.
Limit.
Tonight with Andrew Marr. Watch live on both Global Player and the new LBC app.
6:34. Here is the news from the BBC. A couple of foul-mouthed, self-promoting exhibitionists have said things on a music stage designed to make everybody angry and help them sell more albums. They have succeeded. Everybody is very angry and their names are now much better known. They have been helped in this endeavour by the BBC, which seems not to have noticed a storm of hate speech billowing out of Glastonbury and cut the live feed. The BBC is very sorry. The BBC is always very sorry. Let's talk now to Roger Mosey, the former head of BBC Television News and currently Master of Selwyn College, Cambridge. Roger, had you been in charge this week, how angry would you have been at the way the BBC handled this?
Oh, I would have been pretty cheesed off. I think, though, in fairness, you played the clip of Nick Ferrari a moment or two ago, and the point about the live feed and cutting it isn't totally simple, because at Glastonbury you've got lots of free speech issues. So the point where the group are chanting Free Palestine is okay. 5 seconds later they chant something completely different, which is absolutely wrong, and you've got to make that split-second decision. So that's the problem. However, there's no doubt it was unacceptable, and the BBC's risk assessment seems to be somewhat awry.
Well, that's what puzzles me, because I think almost anybody aged 5 years old or more would have spotted that this was going to be a problem. You know, there's Glastonbury, there's this group, Kneecap, for instance, who have caused all sorts of problems before, landed in court. There is Gaza. There's this huge likelihood of somebody saying something deeply offensive, and yet the BBC seems to have stumbled into this without really thinking about it.
Yes, and I've heard people say today there's plenty of evidence that Bob Vylan had made comments before and behaved at a festival in America in a way that the BBC should have been worried about. And after all, they were putting them on air live at 3 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon, albeit on the iPlayer. And that seems to me to be a failure of risk assessment. You must have taken a different view, as they did with Kneecap, and Kneecap were not allowed to broadcast live. And if there is controversy and issues around a group that are going to be too high risk, they shouldn't have done it. As soon as they did start broadcasting that totally unacceptable language, the plug should have been pulled.
Plug should have been pulled. Every single time something like this happens, because it's not the first time, the BBC has an inquiry and says it's going to look into it, and heads never roll. There's that old BBC expression, deputy heads should roll. Do you think somebody should go for this?
Look, I'm guessing here and speculating, but Glastonbury is run by Music and Entertainment, and it's probably asking quite a lot of a music and entertainment producer who may not be particularly senior to make that call the moment it happens. So I think compliance, that old broadcasting standards thing, really chops in, and you should have senior people who are there monitoring as much as they can, people alerting when there's anything potentially problematic, and that should be the lesson. And after Jonathan Ross and Russell Brand got the BBC into a lot of bother best part of 20 years ago, compliance became a big thing in the BBC, and on these major national events the BBC has to make its compliance better. So simple as that.
Simple as that. Roger Mosey, I'm sure it wouldn't have happened in your time. Thank you very much indeed for talking to me. Now, here's a story which I think for many of you will matter more, perhaps even should matter more than the political crisis we've been talking about. We aren't having enough babies. We aren't replacing ourselves. The fertility rate in England and Wales has now fallen to 1.44 children per woman, the lowest since records began in 1938, and below the 2.1 needed to keep the population steady. When I was younger, people used to talk about the Italians having this problem and the Russians and the Japanese. Well, now we have it too. Short term, that means a working age population too small to properly support the burgeoning number of pensioners and probably too heavily taxed as they try to. Long term, it means, well, you know what it means. Let's begin now by talking to Dr. Alice Evans, who's a senior lecturer in social science and author of the great Gender Divergence. Before we talk about what's going wrong, in long term, it means we die out.
Certainly there is a risk of depopulation, but I think I'm much more concerned about the immediate economic catastrophe worldwide.
And you would say this is fundamentally an economic problem for people around the Western world, but we're talking particularly about Britain today.
It's happening all over the world. In China, the total fertility rate is 1.1, Puerto Rico 0.9, Chile 0.9, everywhere, Turkey 1.5.
The only place where it's not happening is sub-Saharan Africa.
Yes.
And the big difference between us and them is they don't have smartphones, they don't have screens, and they're still mingling in person.
I think that's a likely explanation. So I think that Certainly this is happening everywhere all at once, and we need to pay attention to what are the global drivers and also the local variation. And sub-Saharan, so in much of the world, you and I have this vast improvement in the quality of leisure. So you and I can play video games or go on Instagram or watch whatever TV we like.
But we don't bump into each other in the saloon bar as we might once have done.
Certainly. So that's a certain friction that we've seen a decline in socialising. We've also seen a rise in singles, whereas people in sub-Saharan Africa, they don't have that big leisure and entertainment shock. So maybe, sorry.
That's part. No, I was just going to ask, because you talked about the local or near-at-hand factors, and there seems to be, when I talk to people, a big economic issue here. Young people simply, they can't get housing, they can't get onto the housing ladder, they don't feel life is improving economically, they're really worried about all of that, and the idea of settling down and taking the economic risk of having children feels too much.
I think there is certainly a cost of living crisis in Britain and in many parts of the world, but I don't think, and certainly people's proclivity to make a massive financial, time and emotional investment might be less if they feel their future is uncertain and they themselves might be depressed or anxious. That said, I don't think economics can be the sole explanation, because we see this very rapid change happening everywhere at once, even but not in the poorest countries, right? So that's why I'm thinking it must be something else.
It's really worth reflecting how extraordinary this is, because when I was young, there was a lot of talk about overpopulation and the population bomb and the demographic bomb. There's just far too many of us on the planet to sustain. And it seems to be going into reverse. Perhaps there is some kind of natural self-correction going on.
I think that's a major issue, that we overcorrected, and particularly in India, for example. So people were hugely concerned about overpopulation, so they instilled in schools, in health clinics, have fewer kids. And now the average Indian woman only wants 1.9 kids. But if you don't have that youthful population to sustain your older people, it's an economic crisis for India.
Evans, thank you very, very much indeed. Really, really interesting. And there are also, of course, the technological and social changes. Let's talk to Macken Murphy, a scientist who specialises in human mating behaviour and the Cost of Species podcast.
It's certainly the case that much has been made of dating apps, and it's also true that there are some pernicious qualities that are not unique to the apps, but certainly exacerbated by them. One thing that we see is that on these apps, there is a skewed operational sex ratio, such that there are many more men than women on these apps. And the result of that is that men tend to fare very poorly on them. Because if, it's 7-3 men to women on these apps, well, then there's going to be 4 men left over, even if everyone pairs up randomly, and they don't pair up randomly, by the way. So that's one issue. Another issue is that they are highly looks focused. So they're quite superficial. There's recent research coming out showing that looks matter about 9 times more than biographies on these apps. So there are certainly problems with them. However, I would caution against laying the current problems on the mating market at the feet of these apps, only because it's still the case that most people don't meet on dating apps. Most people still meet in the real world. And not only that, but dating apps have kind of passed their peak already. So my generation, Gen Z, we use these apps less than the previous generation. They've kind of came and peaked, and I think they'll always be a factor, but it's not like they're growing out of control at this point.
Throughout most human history, I guess, most people would meet their partners in some big social group where both sides were, as it were, known, recognised, and their behaviour was therefore to a certain extent controlled. It was either in a shtetl, or it was a community group, or it was a church group, or it was some kind of social group. The less that's the case, then the less people who get together in the first place are going to have the same social backgrounds, and therefore perhaps the harder it is for them to spend the rest of their lives together.
I mean, it's an excellent point, and I would build on it. Not only are they less likely to have the same social backgrounds, but they're also less likely to have an integrated social network that supports the relationship. So if you meet on a dating app, then you're both strangers. Your odds are you have 0 mutual friends. and zero connection supporting you. But normally, you know, if you meet, even if you meet someone at college, right, where you're away from home, at least you'll probably have a shared social circle.
Yeah,
where you can
exactly.
have mutual verification of each other's personal qualities during the courtship stage. That is, you can have someone else to speak to and say, you know, what's this person like? And you can get a real answer as opposed to this intense anonymity that comes from these apps. And then also, if the relationship is on the rocks at any point, you have a mutual social support network to help you through it. It's much easier to break up with a stranger than it is to break up with someone who you have 10 mutual friends with and go to class with.
Absolutely. And Macken, you have an entire podcast, Species, which looks at human mating behaviour. So what do you think are the other big issues here?
Well, I would say that the biggest issue really is that the issues that we're talking about when we're talking about the quote unquote mating crisis, and I'm quite cautious with that term, is most people are talking about delayed marriage and reduced marriage, and they're talking about increased singlehood and increased sexlessness. And these increases date back. I mean, in the UK, there's good data on this going back to the early 90s, for example, and it's shown pretty steady declines in all of those good things since then. And you'll note that that's conspicuously long before dating apps and long before social media came to prominence. So what's happening there? Well, I would say that part of it is obviously this is kind of an overdetermined phenomenon in the sense that there are issues of. And I don't say issues to mean that this is necessarily a bad thing, but factors such as declining religiosity. But I would say that frankly the main factor is growing pains associated with something very good, which is women's tremendous gains and among young women outpacing and overtaking of men in education and employment. Young women are doing really well, and that's a really good thing, but it's a really good thing that also has consequences for the mating market. Our cultural scripts around dating and around mating are built against a world where women were essentially, there's no other way to say it. We're adjusting to a world where women don't need men financially, and we are adapting. There's good signs here, but one of the consequences is that relationships have declined, at least for the moment.
Absolutely fascinating. Really, really good conversation, Macken. Thank you so much for talking to LBC tonight.
Thank you so much for having me on, Andrew. I appreciate it.
Now, coming up, I'll be joined by the man who wants to be the next leader of the Green Party. As Labour focuses on reform voters, could he be the man to give Keir Starmer a problem to his left? The time now, 6:47.
Coming up at 7 on LBC, Ian Dale.
Do you blame the BBC for the Glastonbury farrago? Or do you think this is all a fuss about, well, not much at all? But if you're Jewish, I suspect you might have a rather different perspective.
Ian Dale on LBC. Tonight with Andrew Marr on LBC.
6:49. Let's go back to the politics we were talking about a bit earlier and why Labour has focused more on voters who might go to the right to reform than those to the left, and ask, does that open up a gap? In New York, Democrats have chosen a 33-year-old socialist, Zohran Mamdani, as their candidate for the city mayor, and that is, to say the least, unusual in American politics. Perhaps it's a reaction to the second Trump presidency. Mamdani is a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. Here, of course, there was Jeremy Corbyn for a while, but there hasn't really been a left-wing socialist leader with a national profile since him. Could that person turn out to be my next guest, Zack Polanski, running to be a leader of the Green Party? Zack, it's very good to have you on the show, and we'll know in early September, I think, whether you've made it or not.
That's right. Thanks so much for having me on.
So your reflections on what's going on in New York. It is unusual to hear somebody openly calling themselves a socialist, not only being prominent in American politics, but actually winning.
I think it's been a phenomenal success, and it's really spoken to this moment. I think the key to it is he's been so clear about this is reducing the cost of living, both in America and right here in the UK. People are really suffering. We've seen decades where poor people have got poorer and rich people have got richer, and inequality really lies at the heart of so many of our problems. So yes, he's using the word socialism, and yes, we're talking about left-wing politics, but actually I think this is a politics that can genuinely speak to the majority of the country, because it's about fairness, it's about equality, and it's about reducing this inequality so we can all have better lives.
The big fight going on in the House of Commons is really fundamentally because there isn't enough public money to go around, and they're looking at the welfare bill. Your answer would presumably be higher taxation.
Yes, a wealth tax. So for a long time, I've been advocating for a 2% tax on assets of £10 million or more. There are other measures too, things like bringing capital gains tax in line with income tax. Right now, we're taxing earned income much more than we're taxing unearned wealth. I think to most people, that seems unfair and unsustainable. There's also things too around the Bank of England, where we are giving interest rates to loans that have been given out, so-called quantitative tightening. That could also raise billions of pounds. So there's lots of ways to fund public services. And also there are spending multipliers. So all the money that we spend on public services, we get back into our economy by a boosted economy.
I mean, the problem with talking about raising taxes as a central thing is an awful lot of people think one day that's going to be me and it becomes unpopular. Do you think you can actually persuade middle-income, normal voters, as it were, that it's not them that are going to be hit?
I think it's about really getting the message across that this is the super rich. We're talking about people who are earning money while everyone else is sleeping. So it's not about people using their hands or their brain.
Are there enough of them?
Yes, I think so. And there was a report recently by Henley and Partners that said that a lot of millionaires and billionaires were going to flee the country. That's now largely been discredited. So I think we've overcome the first hurdle, which people said, will they not just leave? And that was a kind of trickle-down economics. I think we're into the second hurdle now, which is making sure that people who run small businesses or medium businesses know they're absolutely part of the solution here. This is really about the 99% versus the 1%, a super elite that for far too long have been destroying our environment, destroying our democracy, and destroying our communities. I think this is a unifying message that can speak to everyone, and that's why I want to be Green Party leader.
Not surprisingly, Keir Starmer and his team are focusing very heavily on voters who might defect from Labour to Reform. Do you think that they are making a big mistake? And in other words, that there are lots more voters to their left who they are alienating? And how big is that Labour vote that you think you can squeeze?
I think it's a catastrophic mistake, and I see my number one mission to make the Labour government more worried about losing votes and seats to the Green Party than to Reform. Now, polling shows that over half of the people who voted Labour just last year are now thinking of voting for the Green Party or the Liberal Democrats. I think when we look at the Liberal Democrats, they've made big successes in the last few years, but actually I couldn't tell you the coherent narrative that brings them together. In the Green Party, I think we have a very strong message, which is about reducing bills, reducing rents, and funding our public services by reducing inequality.
What would you say to people? Say, I'm very involved in green politics, I'm an environmentalist, but I'm not on the left.
I think there's space for lots of people, and I think for anyone who wants to protect the environment or conserve the environment, and that's obviously soft conservatives, people who might have voted Conservative in the past, I think they're increasingly unhappy with what British democracy looks like, both from the Boris Johnson years and the Liz Truss years, and are actually looking for something different. I think this is why, ultimately, those of us who define ourselves on the left have to speak to a much broader group of people to say left-wing politics hasn't necessarily been what you've been told it's been for years, but actually it's just about reducing inequality and making sure everyone's got a fair shot.
And last question, I'd really like your reflection on why it is that the Green Party in this country has done so much less well than Green parties across Europe. And you look at the Germans and you look at Scandinavian countries, the Greens are really, really powerful in those political economies, much less so here. Why?
I think it's about two things. So one, I think a first past the post system has undoubtedly held us back. In the last election, we got nearly 2 million votes, but only got 4 MPs. I think we've demonstrated now, even under first past the post, we've worked out that we can and do win. We need to do much more of that. But secondly, I think we've not been bold enough. So when we go on the media being very proud of the message that we want to send, and also when people criticise us or find what they think are gaps in the plans, really being out there, standing in our truth, being authentic, and really making sure that millions of people in this country hear about the Green Party.
All right, Zack, you've talked about being bold and you do want to be the leader. So let me ask you straightforwardly what you think about the Glastonbury row. Do you think it's right to prosecute or go after Kneecap and Bob Villan, the other group?
I just got back from Glastonbury, so I was there.
You were there. Were you waving a flag?
I was waving lots of flags, but actually I think Glastonbury is not the story here. I think genocide is the story. And we have a British government that are not just complicit, but active participants through the selling of arms, sharing of intelligence, and the fact that they will not condemn Israel's attack on Iran, and indeed the US's attack on Iran. I want Keir Starmer to step up, and I think that has to be the story here.
Well, you heard what Bob Villan said on stage about kill the IDF. Do you support that? Do you think we should be objecting to that?
I wouldn't ever support anyone saying kill something or someone, but I also still think condemnation seems a little bit hypocritical when we're not condemning, or not enough people are condemning, the British government. I think a British government that have access to arms and are literally involved with the killing of people in terms of what those arms are being used for is a lot more serious than an artist standing on stage shouting something that I think at best you could find objectionable, but it's in no way comparable.
And so the police should basically butt out of this too.
I think for most people, they recognise that the police have a lot better things to do. We know that crime in this country, lots of communities feel over-policed and under-protected, and I think we should really be sorting that out rather than policing freedom of expression.
All right, Zack Polanski, thanks very much indeed for coming.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's hot. It's very hot. Did I mention that it's very hot? Huge wildfires in Turkey, and it's broiling in Spain, Italy and southern France. Hot enough here too, and that makes me wonder about Wimbledon. Some great action on the courts already today, but without being silly, does there come a moment when it's simply too hot, north of 30 degrees, for the safety of athletes playing flat out for perhaps 5 hours in temperatures like this? Let's talk now to Dr. Amanda Owens, a sports and performance psychologist and former world-ranked international tennis player herself. Great to have you on the show, Amanda.
Thank you for having me on.
So, straight to the main question. It can be 5 hours of very, very hard exercise out there under a very, very intense heat. Is it safe?
Well, I mean, this is extraordinary. Obviously the heat that the players are playing on today, at the start of Wimbledon. Yes, it can be dangerous. However, these players are mentally tough, mentally resilient, and physiologically they've been training abroad, and they do specific heat training as well as out. Yes.
Tell me about that.
Okay, so the likes of Jack Draper, Emma Raducanu, and the Brits, they do take themselves away to Miami or to certain parts of the globe to train under intense heat and use some.
Well, they go deliberately to the hottest places they can, more or less.
Well, it's where they have their training camps, but they also include now heat training, which is part and parcel of being a professional tennis player, and getting acclimatised to heat. Obviously, you know, the physiological impact, I'm not a physiologist, I'm a psychologist, but what we know is that from a mood perspective, yes, of course it impacts. Okay, it's going to impact decision making. It's going to impact fatigue levels, physically and mentally. It's also going to impair, from a behavioural perspective, more irritability.
Well, because you're a psychologist, let's talk a little bit about the psychology of it, because part of the problem here is that these are people who are conditioned and determined to drive themselves to the absolute edge to win a game. You know, we've seen Andy Murray just pushing himself and pushing himself and pushing himself.
Yes.
They're not people who are naturally likely to think, do you know what, this is too much, and pull back. And as the temperatures get up, presumably the risks get bigger too.
No, absolutely, they do. However, Wimbledon do have safety measures in place and player welfare in place, and also, of course, you know, there's a certain temperature that is known as is too dangerous. However, Players are, accustomed to this heat. I want to make this clear. So
they're toughies. They're toughies.
They're mentally tough, mentally resilient.
All right.
What we haven't thought about, though, is the line judges.
Well, we'll have another conversation about the line judges, because our line judge says it's time for the programme to end, sadly. But thank you very much indeed for that. I'll be back with you tomorrow, but if you've missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on both Global Player and the LBC app, where you can stay up to date with all the latest news and opinion. You can put your news categories in the order you want. You can pause, you can rewind live radio, and you can listen to a range of podcasts. Download the official LBC app for free from your app store now. Coming up at 10 on LBC, it's Ben Kentish. But right now, it's time for Ian Dale.
Thanks, Andrew. Lisa Nandy, the Culture Secretary, says she's not satisfied with the answers the BBC have given as to how and why the disgraceful remarks made at Glastonbury by a no-mark idiot, who I'm not going to name because he doesn't merit the publicity. Is it right for the government to call the BBC to account like this? Isn't this what Ofcom is for? Do you blame the BBC, or do you think this is all a fuss about, well, not much at all? But if you're Jewish, I suspect you might have a different view. At 8 on Cross Question, Labour MP Charlotte Nichols, The Spectator's James Heal, Conservative peer Tina Stoll, and political commentator Rachel Shabby. And at 9, what does the word disability mean to you?
On your radio, on the LBC app, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 7 o'clock, police have started a criminal investigation into the performance of Bob Vylan at Glastonbury Festival on Saturday. Officers are looking into what appeared to be anti-Semitic comments and chants made by the